In 2020, Team Cherry publicly stated, quote, "We're trying to be really mindful that we want this to be a game that new people can come into and experience as their first Hollow Knight game, and that it sits alongside the original game, and the difficulty also sits alongside the game in that way." While that's hysterical with modern context, this is not a video about how Team Cherry turned evil. Instead, I want to talk about what happens when 3 artists fueled by limitless goodwill get 7 uncompromised years to refine their craft, and how Silksong is a testament to the sheer confidence they were filled with in the wake of their overwhelming success. And to be clear, I'm not claiming they developed a BDSM kink to abuse their audience, knowing they're largely exempt from consequence, but how in reality, the universal praise gave them enough assurance in their skills as developers to not apologize for challenge, and in doing so, revealing how a studio's philosophy towards difficulty is a direct reflection of their maturity, and why the margin between precision and punishment is where the best game design is done. Because in an industry obsessed with accessibility and difficulty options, Silksong's choice of intentionality tells us something vital about what happens when developers trust their players. But before that, I understand there was some inflammatory language in that last passage, so let me make my personal views on difficulty clear. Not every game is for everyone, and devs should be allowed to craft whatever experience is best for their game. However, as a paying customer, if you want to use mods or cheats to make the experience more fun, then no one else can tell you you're wrong for doing so. As a YouTuber, it's important for my essays that I don't use those methods, at least on initial playthroughs, but if you're not concerned about developer intent, then more power to you. So with all sides successfully enraged, let's get back to Silksong. Many have mistaken it for a Souls-like, including myself, when in reality, Hollow Knight and by extension Silksong are actually metroidvanias with an emphasis on combat. And the reason it's misunderstood as a Souls-like is because it draws its inspirations from the same sources as Dark Souls, namely Castlevania, creating the labyrinthine and oppressive atmosphere of Hollow Nest. But where FromSoft turned to Ocarina of Time as a baseline for gameplay, Team Cherry chose to emulate Ninja Gaiden and Mega Man X and their focus on movement and platforming. And Silksong, as a sequel to Hollow Knight, embraces the DNA of its sources with more confidence than its predecessor. See, there's a genetic difference between Ocarina of Time and Ninja Gaiden, and that's the fact these games are from 2 different eras of design. Where Ocarina of Time is firmly from the home console generation of games, and as such expects you to eventually complete the journey, Ninja Gaiden and Mega Man X are both from the transitional era away from arcade machines, where difficulty was linked to monetization and sucked down quarters whilst taunting you, meaning developers had financial incentive to make their games as frustrating as possible in an effort to bleed consumers dry. I mean, we've all seen these psychotic challenge run videos online, and there are publishers that salivate at the thought of charging these mentally unstable people for every death. Team Cherry, now with the full backing of the internet, finally decided to commit to this classic era from their childhoods and make a game that emulated their overly punishing design. This can be seen in the very fabric of Farloom, which has a vertical design based around ascension in opposition to Hollow Knight's descent-focused direction. This allows them to more directly echo the wall-jumping corridors of Ninja Gaiden, where a single mistake means retrying an entire sequence, as well as the focus on precision towards combat and platforming, as Hornet's initial moveset requires far more accuracy than the Knight's. And of course the infamous 2-mask damage standard, which allows for minimal mistakes on the part of the player. All of this is the language of classic 2D action platformers, spoken fluently, where the increased difficulty is merely an inheritance of what Hollow Knight was always trying to be. And so the joke of Team Cherry going evil only lands if you think they were still following in the footsteps of FromSoft's tough but fair design philosophy, when in reality, Silksong is a haunted version of Metroid, where instead of power armor, Samus is sheathed in a dress of Baroque silk. But of course, Hollow Knight was nowhere near as brutal as Silksong, and this of course is the fear that grips every new developer. That instinct to not drive away potential players by making your game too brutal, which dominated the industry until FromSoft dispelled it come 2011. But of course, Dark Souls was not their first game. It was only after they established their foothold that they boldly pushed the envelope. So for an indie studio of 3 people with no word of mouth behind them, making an overly punishing game is a quick way to dissuade potential players from finishing your game. Luckily, Hollow Knight maintains a mostly fair difficulty for its runtime, and it's also complemented by its lovingly hand-drawn art style. But after quickly becoming one of the most beloved indie darlings, Team Cherry no longer needed to worry about filtering casual players. Because Hollow Knight 1 gave each of them generational wealth, they're no longer constrained by the financial motivations to make games, and are free to be as indulgent and artistic as they wish. Which is the ultimate fantasy of any creative. I too yearn for the day I can hopefully break free of the YouTube algorithm and make videos that can discuss more than one game at a time. And while an artist's passion project often doesn't translate into their best work, Silksong seems to have surpassed the original in the eyes of many, but Team Cherry's legacy is still young. So let's look at how their passion translated into the mechanics of Silksong, starting with their most fundamental change, the protagonist. Hornet's differences from the Knight cascade through every system in ways you might feel but can't articulate. The Knight is a grounded yet methodical fighter, capable of instant acceleration but deliberate momentum. His weaknesses are his low jumps, punishing full speed, and pogo-based vertical movement, which requires commitment. In stark contrast, Hornet has greater directional control, increased speed, decreased weight, and is capable of sustaining her aerial presence. So if you happen to replay the original in the run-up to Silksong, your muscle memory would sabotage you as the physics wouldn't translate between the two. And while your newfound freedom is exhilarating for the first 2 hours, enemies quickly require you to not drift through their attack patterns, which is where Silksong's design demands elegance rather than grit. Because Team Cherry had a choice to make. They could nerf Hornet's mobility and reuse enemy archetypes from the original, or evolve their combat to match her new capabilities. And because this game took 7 years to make, you already know what option they went with. To quote Pelin directly, "The basic Ant Warrior is built from the same moveset as the original Hornet boss, the same core set of dashing, jumping, and dashing down at you, plus we added the ability to evade and check you." That right there perfectly exemplifies Silksong's design philosophy. What was once a major boss that required 3 minutes of focus is now a trash mob encountered 8 times before reaching the deep docks. In fact, nearly every basic enemy in Silksong has dash combos, directional variation, and the ability to read your approach, so they're responding to Hornet's agility in ways that force you to adapt. As Gibson so clearly puts it, quote, "Hornet is inherently faster and more skillful than the Knight, so even the base-level enemy had to be more complicated, more intelligent." Now, while there's certainly a valid reading of that statement as an admission of sadism, I see it far more as a sign of respect for their audience. Team Cherry won't insult us by recycling their old encounters and designing them for another slow character. They've built a world that acknowledges what both we and Hornet are capable of, and demands both of us literally rise to the challenge. But of course, like most difficult games, the element that causes the most ire among the community is the bosses. And that's where Silksong's most insidious design shift lies, because every boss has been altered in a way almost no player could realize. This is how Pelin described the change, quote, "One thing we did totally differently in Silksong is that we reworked how the bosses picked their attacks. Where in Hollow Knight, the bosses were reacting to your position, so you could bait them into certain attacks such as dashing or slashing based on your distance, which taught you to predict attack patterns based on positioning you controlled in a call-and-response dance. Silksong inverts that design, and the bosses now decide their action first, then change their own positioning in order to execute it. As Pelin put it, quote, "Bosses generally decide what they want to do and then move into the correct position to do it. The action gets decided first." That choice causes a fundamental shift in the design that cascades into the game's perceived difficulty in a way players won't be able to identify and therefore adapt to. Since the bosses are now proactive, that means they're less readable, and now you have to read the commitment in their animation, which is why many bosses have wind-ups measured in the microseconds, because you're expected to read their intentions as well as their assaults. Which I'd imagine is the source of frustration for most of the Hollow Knight veterans, because they're not aware that the established rules have been broken. The last judge's short retreat will likely be interpreted as a breather because it's reacting to your position before it begins its attack, when in reality the attack has already started and you won't know until you've already been hit. The reason for this is so that the bosses are better at countering Hornet's mobility. To put it in the most morbid terms imaginable, if we were still holding the leash, we'd break the boss's neck. And whilst withholding this knowledge is certainly unfair, there is a kind of beauty in how it makes death less arbitrary. There is no worse feeling than dying because you were in the wrong position, such as the orbs during the platforming section of the Radiance. And so while adaptation is immensely harder, it's harder in a way that demands the mastery of pattern recognition rather than mechanical exploitation. As such, Silksong ends up replacing random cruelty with boss sophistication. Although Team Cherry made another deliberate design choice that feeds into the escalated difficulty more than any tweaking of the mechanics. The rejection of traditional metroidvania gatekeeping and putting world-driven logic in its place. To quote Gibson, "It's a specific kind of lock and key type of progression, and we try to submerge that element in favor of a more naturalistic world. Metroidvanias have a fixed sequence to unlocking their abilities in order to unlock progression. This is why sequence breaking is considered an achievement. While Silksong doesn't completely escape this structure, it softened it considerably. At any key juncture, you'll always have 3 or 4 valid directions to explore. They could lead to the next progression-halting boss, or an optional area with an upgrade so powerful it alters your entire playstyle. It's genuine freedom, but it comes with a consequence. Without forced progression, the difficulty has to be based around the enemy's sophistication rather than ability progression. Remember how when you first started Dark Souls 1 and you had no idea how to stop the skeletons from reviving and rage quit the game? And once it was time to face Gravelord Nito, you had the items necessary to keep them down for good. Silksong can't pull that trick, because it offers such freedom that it's impossible to scale the difficulty because there's no way to account for what abilities or skills the player might have unlocked. As Gibson said, quote, "We allow you to go way off the path. One player may choose to follow it directly, another may constantly divert. You have choices all the time about where you're going and what you're doing," which is going to trigger an automatic increase of difficulty because Team Cherry's working without the safety net of linear progression, and so more sophisticated enemies is the only way to preserve challenge across the multiple paths. They're treating Farloom like an ecosystem for you to discover, rather than a massive level for you to fully unlock, and so difficulty becomes a form of environmental storytelling. And so players end up mistaking cruelty for ambition because Silksong's abandoned the traditional Metroidvania structure of progression gating to create a world meant to enable your freedom. But it's the arduous development timeline that acts as the ultimate proof of Team Cherry's pride. Hollow Knight 1 was built in 3 years of Kickstarter funding, which of course carries an immense psychological toll, as you don't know if you're going to be successful when your audience has already put their faith in you, so you might make alterations in order to appease as many of your supporters as possible. Meanwhile, Silksong had 7 years of uncompromised development, no marketing team pushing for selling points, no corporate overlords that stood between idea and implementation, and much to the annoyance of the fandom, no deadline. As Gibson put it, quote, "We're in control of our destiny, and certainly of the games that we make. There are no gatekeepers between decisions," with Palin adding, quote, "The best way to develop is one where you've got the shortest time between coming up with an idea and then getting to make it." And so Silksong is the result of that freedom on a 7-year timeline, allowing for sophisticated iteration on enemy AI, reprogramming the attack pattern of the bosses, and refined vertical movement until Hornet felt like a true evolution to the Knight, which afforded Team Cherry the opportunity to see what didn't work and make something different. Compare this to Metroid Prime 4, where according to an interview, Retro was aware that the open world didn't benefit the game, but restarting again was no longer an option. There's certainly a temptation in game design, especially for indies hoping to make it big, to soften the difficulty in the hopes of widespread adoption. But Silksong's rejection of that philosophy allowed it to be made as if it was intended without apology. As Palin said, quote, "The goal is that we have this idea for a game, and we get to make the best version that we can of that game. One that satisfies the theme, not that sells well." That theme, when applied to Silksong, is one of oppression and agency reclaimed through perseverance. And a game built around the overwhelming presence of the Citadel demands that every area and enemy reinforces that presence with an intense combat rhythm. And those 7 years and small dev team allowed Team Cherry to build the game with a precision that no other studio could hope to match, which resulted in a game of uncompromised vision, So what looks like evil is actually the product of the confidence to make exactly the game they wanted, with all the complexity intact, with the hope and trust players would meet them there. With all that said, I can certainly admit that Silksong is only fair in a way that contradicts modern difficulty discourse, and understanding that contradiction shows why the game feels uniquely cruel. See, there are two ways to measure fairness in game design. One is the FromSoft method, which is based on clear telegraphs where success comes from predicting attack patterns and defeat comes from a mechanical error you made. Of course, FromSoft themselves don't always adhere to this design, which leads to their most frequently criticized boss fights. But with that said, this is the fairer version of difficulty, and Silksong subscribes to the other, which is the NES-era fairness, which demands precision, tight margins, and success is only achievable through the repetition of large sections. In Silksong, the margin for error is razor thin. At the start of the game, you can only take a maximum of 3 hits, boss runbacks create a test of attrition, and healing is an infrequent high-risk maneuver you have to earn through combat. All of this design language is inherent from platformers where quarters mattered, but Silksong has notable exceptions that redeem it from those scummy mechanics. Most notably is the snappy instant movement, which is bereft of sudden acceleration or fuzzy input buffering, making each mistake your fault and not because the controls betrayed you. This is something Pelin directly stated about Hollow Knight 1. Quote, "There's just no fuzziness about the gameplay, so when you do make a mistake, you don't feel too frustrated at the game. You can feel frustrated that you've perhaps missed an input." A philosophy Silksong inherited and sharpened with refined controls and higher visual clarity. Yes, the punishment for error is far more severe, but it's still legible. You're still able to optimize around Silksong's challenges because the systems are comprehensible, unlike RPGs like FromSoft's, which require frequent wiki consultation. All the mechanical elements of Silksong are understandable just from their in-game effects, and exploration allows you to mitigate the challenge even further by way of the many upgrades hidden around Farloom, as well as the multiple directions that unlock progress. All of that is the game trusting you, and that trust is what makes Silksong feel so incredibly hard, because it refuses to apologize for trusting you. But within that trust, the game stays fair. The margin for error is tight, but you will never fail in Silksong due to luck, showcasing Team Cherry's design confidence, as they built the rare type of game that's hard enough to demand mastery, whilst retaining enough transparency to make mastery achievable. So maybe Team Cherry became evil to those who simply wanted a sequel to Hollow Knight, but if you wanted an evolution of Hollow Knight, they've retained their fairness in a way that demands respect. So calling them evil is a misdiagnosis for the correct symptom. Silksong is harder than Hollow Knight, only a fool would claim otherwise, but I believe many have mistaken malice for intention. Over the last 7 years, Team Cherry evolved from a constrained 3-person studio, making a metroidvania on a Kickstarter budget of $60k Australian dollars, to a studio known and beloved worldwide, with the full backing of the gaming community behind them. And so the curious and naive knight was swapped with a confident and capable warrior that embraced non-linear exploration and an escalating challenge, where every design choice traced back to coherence, the enemies are harder and bosses more proactive to match your increased speed. The more sophisticated difficulty is to combat your expanded freedom of choice and exploration. This difficulty spike is the signature of a studio that has grown in its ability to implement mechanics, where the change doesn't come from their morality, but their capability, and their freedom to express their exact intention without compromise, which is a reflection of Silksong's immense cultural impact because it outright refuses modern accommodation culture. In a market and industry that's rightly shifting towards accessibility, but for the sinister reason of expanding their potential revenue rather than wishing for genuine inclusion, Team Cherry chose to craft a singular vision where the game is harsh because they've chosen to deepen their idea for what a game should be, where the goal was to respect the skills of a specific group of players and cause them to genuinely resonate with this unique experience. And if you can understand that, it reframes the entire discourse around the game's difficulty, because this uncompromised vision reveals a lot about what indie game design could be. It's incredibly hard to get noticed on the internet. I mean, look at the amount of uploads on this channel and you'll know I speak from experience. So I too felt the urge to rapid fire as much content as possible and an urge to get as big an audience as I could. And yet a few weeks ago, I made my first long-form video on Silent Hill 2, and it resonated so powerfully that I've gained what would be a month's worth of subscribers from a single video. The reason it took me so long to put in that amount of effort into a single project is because I was scared it would fail and my effort would be wasted. But the incredibly passionate response from both commenters and subscribers has made me throw out my old model entirely, and this beautifully translates to indie games. See, AAA is already trying and succeeding in appealing to the mass market, so a small team is never going to peel off the audience by trying the same thing. Instead, they need to hyper-focus on an undistilled niche experience that may not have broad appeal, but can resonate harder with some players than anything designed by a committee could ever hope to. And it's not an easy lesson to learn, which is the reason why Silksong is not only a sequel, but the hardest Metroidvania in a decade, because it took such an overwhelming amount of support from their audience to let them make a game only they could make. Thank you so much for watching. For more essays, here's one going more in depth on how the boss AI was changed.